There are so many epic waterfalls in Iceland, and Godafoss is one of my very favorites.
All right, guys, we're here in northern Iceland at Godafoss waterfall. It's just after sunrise. We spent the morning trying to scout additional locations and found it to be sort of an icy death trap on the rocks. We don't have any crampons for our shoes, so we made it down to this lower area that's safe right now, and we've kind of gauged where the sun is. We've set up for this one shot here, and though I'm not really happy with the shot, it's still nice, and we use the time to kind of explore where we can access. So what we're going to do is wait around until sunset, when the sun position is going to be a little bit more helpful for us, and we're going to get to more of a beautiful vantage point to shoot it. So as you can see with the test shot I've taken already, this position's pretty nice, and I have some of the sunlight causing some color on the clouds coming in from the left of the frame. This wide shot looks pretty good, but as soon as I start to zoom in more, I'm going to lose the details in the sky. So then it's just going to be a framed waterfall against a mountainscape, which I don't find very interesting. So with this shot in particular, the light's coming from the left side of my frame. The sun's actually rising outside on the left of the frame. So I know that right now in my shot, I'm getting some nice refracted color on the clouds just to the right that's inside of my shot. As the sun starts to rise a little bit more, that light, as the sun gets higher, is going to start to illuminate the mountains on the right side of my frame, as well as the canyon and cliff face next to the waterfall. So if I wanted to get this shot, I'd wait a little bit longer for the color of the sun and the light to come up a little bit higher to be able to illuminate parts of the scene. So right now, since we're a little bit lower and the canyon wall is a little bit higher, the sun's low enough to give nice color in the sky, but not high enough to put light in the scene. That canyon wall, since the sun is behind it, is never going to get any light. And the sun rises right here, but by the time it sets, it's really not that far to the right that it's setting. So there's never a time where the sun's going to clock around and illuminate that canyon wall. We will get a little bit of light over here on the right, on those rocks, or at least we hope to, and probably on the top of the mountain. So in Adobe Camera Raw or Camera Raw software, we can bump that contrast a little bit and bring up the shadows so that it doesn't look so dark. So one thing that I see in photography a lot that I don't think really looks good is when there's a beautiful fiery sky behind a scene that has no natural light in it, where it's just completely dark. A lot of the times photographers will use that and try to light paint extra light in Photoshop. Where in these types of landscapes, sometimes you just have to wait maybe an hour more for the sun to come up just a little bit higher and start throwing those correct reflections in the scene. Working with natural light in your environments will always look more realistic than trying to paint it in later. When we were at the cliffs, we talked about how slower shutter speeds affect the water and the streaky effects that we can get around that. Today, we're going to be using neutral density filters to push those exposures just a little bit farther to see what those slow shutter effects have on the water here.
We decided to hike around to the other side of the waterfall to set up for sunset.
So now you can see we're on the complete other side of the waterfall. I abandoned my position I had earlier. At first I was waiting for the sun to maybe have a nice set over there in a good position, but it's kind of clouded up, it's a little bit overcast, so I decided to explore a little bit instead. As we started to hike around, I noticed that the view of the waterfall gets really epic here. So I stopped here first so we can kind of take a look at the shot, talk about the composition, and I feel like the more I keep moving around this waterfall, the nicer it's going to look. And since I sort of have a flat sky, I don't really have to be concerned about the light right now. I'm more concerned about the composition, really trying to find a nice way to frame this waterfall from above. All right, so as you can see, we're at the top of the waterfall. Just out of frame to the right is actually where I was standing this morning. And as usual, I'm starting at 16 millimeters and I'm going to kind of zoom in. What really captured my attention about this area are these really, really nice foreground elements on the bottom. You can see those rocks. Now, once I start to frame things up, the first thing I noticed that if I trust the level in my camera, and I'm going to set that just like that, that is perfectly level. You can see that the horizon actually slopes down from the upper left to the upper right. Now, I know that my camera says this is the correct level horizon, and I know it is the level horizon, but I just don't think it looks right. So in this case, I'm actually going to offset it a little bit so that that horizon actually looks level visually, but the camera actually is saying that it's not. So in this case, I'm going to use my eyes to kind of overwrite it just to paint a nicer picture of something that looks 100% right. And I'm going to close down the frame of view just a little bit so it frames the entire waterfall and these really nice rocks in the foreground. So anytime that I can, I really like to use interesting foreground elements. So in this case, these rocks are really spiky. They add some interest to the lower right, and they help frame the waterfall itself. So it's not just a bunch of water washing off to the right. There's actually a little bit more interest and a little bit more personality to the shot. All right, so already this shot looks much better than the other side. I'm gonna keep traveling around to see if I can find an even better vantage point. All right, so I've moved around a little bit more and got a different vantage point of this waterfall, and I have to say I really, really like it. It even looks like I could go down a little bit further and get right up next to this waterfall. But for this demonstration, I think I can illustrate everything better if we stay up here. So first of all, let's work on our composition here. So I've kind of set up in this elevated area. So let's move it, leaving it at 16 millimeter. And again, I'm going to use my in-camera guides, not the leveling system, to offset that horizon. Now I really, really like the way this looks. There's some nice rocky stuff in the foreground. From the bottom right, across the bottom of the frame, into this close waterfall actually wraps the viewer all the way around the shape of the waterfall and back out the top right side. So this is really nice. And again, this is also at 16 millimeter. And I think we can actually go in a little bit further and it'll still look really nice. And also bear in mind that I'm shooting wide 16:9, so with a 4:3 camera, we'll actually be able to get a little bit more out of this. Now, I don't want to cut those mountains off. There we go. See, something like that works. Now that's not 16 millimeter, that's actually 20 millimeters. So I think the key to this shot, unless we were to get down closer to that waterfall where it's just rushing over the edge, is to really shoot a wide angle, somewhere between 16 and 24. And again, remember, when you're outside of 16:9 mode and just regular 4:3, we'll get a lot more of the top and bottom of frame, be able to adjust accordingly. So I really like this position. I have the lens on that I need. Everything looks really good. And since the light's starting to fade, this is a good time to start demonstrating how to get the soft water effect in waterfalls. All right, so I'm gonna pause here for a second because the wind shifted. Since we're close to a waterfall, that means I'm getting some mist. I don't really want to get water drops on my lens, so I'm gonna take a shower cap that I lifted from the hotel room this morning, and I'm just gonna cover up the top of the camera just to secure the lens.
Now, I know this may seem a little ridiculous, but rain covers are very expensive. Shower caps are free, and they're honestly one of the best solutions I've found.
Okay, so first of all, camera's all set up. I have my composition locked in. So just for fun, let's put the camera to P mode, which is basically its auto mode, and see what the camera wants to do with this scene. At ISO 100, the camera has chosen the lowest f-stop on this lens, which is f4, and it's also chosen 1/50th of a second for its shutter speed. All right, so looking at this shot, it's correctly exposed. We can bring some of the shadows back using camera raw. But since the shutter speed is so fast at 150, it's freezing that water in time, and I really want to get a soft, dreamy effect to the water. So I'm going to use aperture priority mode here, and I'm going to go back to my standard landscape settings, which is an ISO of 100 at f8, and the camera is metering the shutter speed to be 1/8 of a second now. So let's go ahead and get a shot and see what it looks like. Okay, so looking at this frame, that's 1/8 of a second instead of the 1/50th of a second. And you can see that the water's starting to soften just a little bit. Now let's take our in-camera settings and start pushing it a little bit further and see how long we can make the exposure. All right, let's go as far as we can. First thing I'm gonna do is bring the ISO all the way down to its low 1.0. I'm gonna bring the f-stop all the way up to f22, and it looks like I'll be able to get an exposure time of 2.5 seconds. All right, let's see what the 2.5 second exposure looks like. Wow, it's already starting to look really nice. You can see that the water is starting to get incredibly soft. And from the other exposure at 1/8 of a second, it's a world of difference at 2.5 seconds. Now we're starting to get that dreamy look. If you look at the waterfall on the left and the actual falls in the back of the frame, you can see that they're really silky smooth. Now I'm getting this water wash effect. You can see that the water, the turbulent water below, is now turning really white. And you can also see that it's all, we're starting to get these streaky lines to the right of the frame. So now that we've pushed it as far as we can go in camera, let's use some camera filters to take it even further. So what I have here is a filter holder for the front of my lens, and I also have a 4-stop solid neutral density filter by Format High Tech. These are Firecrest filters. They are glass filters. They are incredibly powerful, and they leave 0 color cast. So we can do very, very long exposures shooting through this glass and not get any discoloration on the frame. It's a really, really cool technique to use. Think of solid neutral density filters as sunglasses for the front of your camera. They come in all different types of stops. As I said, this is a 4-stop. They come in 10 and now 16 stops. So from very, very clear and neutral to very, very dark and powerful. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to slide this filter into the holder. I'm going to walk around to the front of my camera and I'm going to put it on the lens. So I have an adapter ring that's at 77 millimeter mount, so it's specifically made to fit 77 millimeter lenses. The 16 to 35 has that diameter. So what I do is I screw this on first in the threads, and then I can take this holder. It also has a little screw pin here, and I can slide it on the front of that and then tighten it and lock it in. Another tip with using filters, this one has 3 different slots, so I could actually stack 3 filters. But since I'm only using one, I like to have the filter as close to the lens as possible. So in this case, it's right there in the first slot. This format of filters is much better than, let's say, having the screw-on filters, because all I need to do is buy one filter holder and then I buy different lens adapters. These adapter rings will then fit on any of my lenses, and I can use this filter holder with any of the lenses and only buy the filters once, because with the holder, I can just swap the filters out. All right, so now the filter's on the front of the lens. I can push things a little bit further because it adds 4 more stops on the front, so it gives me more flexibility for changing the exposure. When I work with neutral density filters, I like to work in manual mode because I want to control every aspect of the camera, from the aperture to the ISO to the shutter speed, and I want to be able to make adjustments on the fly on my own. So what I've done here is I'd set the ISO to 100, I set the f-stop to f8, and I'm going to do a 4-second exposure, just as our baseline of a good place to start. All right, so as you can see, it's already starting to look pretty nice. In the filter, there's no discoloration. These Firecrest filters are really amazing at maintaining all that color and detail. Now that I have this 4 seconds, we're already seeing that nice effect of that soft water. Let's take it one more stop. Now with shutter speed, it's interesting. Since I'm at 4 seconds, another stop would be 8 seconds. So I'm going to continuously double this shutter speed until we get to something that's really high. So we'll start, 4 will now become 8 seconds. So since I'm changing it to 8 seconds, I'm also going to take the ISO down to compensate. So instead of 100, I'm going to use 64. So this is f8, ISO 64, and an 8-second exposure. Now let's see what it looks like. So this 8-second exposure looks pretty good. And compared to the 4-second exposure, the only thing that's really different is now that whitewash on the bottom in that turbulent water below is leaving a nice streaky effect across the right of the frame. That was 8 seconds. Let's go ahead and max out the in-camera shutter speed at 30 seconds to see what it does. So I'm at f8, so I'm going to go up to, let's say, f13, and I'm going to bring the shutter to 30 seconds. I'm just doing this in manual mode. I'll bring the ISO down to 50, which is low 1.0, and I'm going to test this. 30 seconds, f13, low ISO. All right, so let's look at the comparison again. This was 8 seconds here, and this is 30 seconds. Now, as you guys can see, not much changes again on the waterfall. That stays nice and dreamy, but I really like the 30-second exposure compared to the 8-second exposure because of the water. You guys can see in the 8-second exposure there on the water, we can still see some of the turbulence. That whitewash down there isn't really perfect. There's still some disturbance in it. And when we get into the 30-second exposure instead, it's leaving these really long, misty tendrils and instead of that turbulence. So instead of having noisy, rough water down there, it's completely smoothed out the water and created these nice directional leading lines of soft water effect. So at 30 seconds, we have now maximized what our camera can capture automatically. The only way that we can do a longer exposure than 30 seconds is to switch the camera to bulb mode and use a trigger release. Now this is the Nikon intervalometer. It works with this camera, and the most important feature, the only feature you really need to do these timed exposures, is a lockable trigger button. And if I press it and slide it, it'll actually lock. Now, you don't actually have to have it locked, but if you don't have it locked, then you have to actually keep your finger pressed down the whole time. So we're gonna set this to be a 60-second exposure in bulb mode, and we're gonna lock this trigger down, and then on the front of this is a little timer, and this timer is gonna count so that I can precisely grab a 60-second exposure. Now, it's one thing, I have no idea why the camera companies lock us to only be able to do 30 seconds. It's something that I really wish we could time our exposures in camera for longer than that. So until they decide to unlock that feature, you're gonna need one of these guys to get the job done. As far as Nikon goes, this is the high-end one. It's not just for these long exposures. It's a full intervalometer. Allows you to do time-lapse work as well. It's a little on the pricey side. It's the MC36A, but you can actually get a $5 version that just has a trigger that's lockable too. So that's perfectly acceptable. Anything that allows you to have an off remote that's lockable with the camera will do. So let's go ahead and set this up. I have this hook on the bottom of my camera here. It's really nice. Allows me to just hook that in. This just goes into the socket here on the left of my camera. It's really, really basic, though everything's a little harder to do with gloves on. And I'm just gonna screw that in so it's locked in place. So now that I have the trigger set up, let's toggle the camera to bulb mode. So inside of manual mode, once you're at 30 seconds, another click with the dial will take you into bulb, and it'll say BULB, and that's how you know that you can time your own exposures. From here on out, the only way to expose is to either press this button down on the camera or lock your button right here, and as soon as you release it, it'll stop exposing. So it's completely controlled by you. The reason why you wouldn't want to hold the button on the top of the camera is you're going to actually vibrate the camera. There's no way to hold it without disturbing it. So since this is taking a long exposure, it's over time, 60 seconds, we want the camera to stay as still as possible. Any disturbance, any vibration, anything like that will cause our frame to be blurry. So before I was at 30 seconds, now I'm in bulb mode. I want to shoot for 60 seconds. So at f13, I'm going to actually raise that to f16. I'm not going to go a full stop because the light's been fading this whole time. So I have a feeling from f13 to f16 should be able to make up the difference. All right, so from 30 seconds to 60 seconds, really not seeing much of a difference. Certainly not enough of a difference to warrant needing to shoot higher than 30 seconds in this case. What you really see is just an extra accumulation of mist on the right side of the frame on the dark cliff area. But other than that, the water, it looks pretty similar. We get a few more tendrils of the white lines there, but 30 is pretty good. I don't really see any need to use a 60-second exposure over a 30 in this case. Now this was kind of a fun experiment. So we were able to get the shot we wanted at 30 seconds, but we tested 60 just in case. Who knows? You never know. Sometimes that could come out better. But for situations like this, there's not that much to soften overall. It's really just creating that soft water effect. Now this is an artistic effect. Some people don't like to soften their water. Some people like to see every little bead and water drop from the waterfalls. This is really going to be up to you, and it's going to be your own artistic expression. Personally, I really like the soft water effect on the waterfalls, and I think it's something that we see a lot in work, and it's something that registers as being appropriate for waterfalls. Doesn't necessarily mean you need to do a 30-second exposure every time. Sometimes you can get away with a 2-second, a 4-second, or even a 10-second exposure. It really depends on how soft you want the surrounding water and elements to be. So this was a cool example of using a 4-stop neutral density Firecrest filter. Later on in this tutorial, we're going to be using other filters too. We're going to use a 10-stop, and that's going to let us drag that shutter to really long lengths. So this morning we had an incredible sky, but I was not happy with the vantage point that we found. Now we don't have much of a sky at all. In fact, it's pretty overcast, but I couldn't be happier with this location. It's beautiful. And with a little bit of work to push the exposure and get something that looks a little bit more dreamy, I think we have a really, really good shot here. In fact, I like it better with the dull sky and the soft exposure than just a mediocre composition and a fiery sky. So as usual, let's go into Photoshop and make it even better.
Welcome to post-processing lesson number 3, Godafoss waterfall. This is where we started to use really long exposures using a 4-stop neutral density filter to extend and drag that shutter much longer than we could at the cliffs. Remember, in the cliffs we did everything in camera. This time we're doing everything in bulb mode so that I can control the shutter. And I was able to get different exposure times, even up to 30 and 60 seconds. So I've already loaded the Lightroom project. Again, you can go into the directory, lesson number 3, load the Lightroom project, and it'll get you right here. Before I start editing, I want to talk a little bit more about my setup here. You guys have been seeing me work on this Wacom Intuos small tablet, and I have a keyboard. Everything is actually being run by my MacBook Pro laptop back there, and this is a Bluetooth keyboard, and this is plugged in via USB. So in the last lesson, I showed you guys how I have some express keys bound to the pen, and I was able to change my brush size, and I was able to use the pressure sensitivity options in the brush by using the stylus. Now this is going to come in handy for all future lessons, and I want to point out one more thing. This is the smallest Intuos Pro tablet that they make. This comes with me no matter where I go, 22 to 26 countries per year. This is always in my bag with me. I use it all the time. It's so small, though, that I have the keyboard to the left, which allows me with my left hand to apply hotkeys, and on my right hand, paint. If I don't want to use the hotkeys on the keyboard, I actually have more sets of express keys on the left. So later on, I'll try to get into more about the express keys, but right now this is really powerful because I can paint, change options, and access the hotkeys all at once. So let's get started on this file. Inside of Lightroom here is pretty much going to be the same thing that we saw before. Again, we just have different raw files. Remember, this was Godafoss waterfall. Godafoss, the god of waterfalls in Iceland. It is really amazing. We all really love it, and I love each visit every time that I go here. And this is going to be a progression from the left to right, and really pay attention to the settings here. The first one is 1/40, and at 1/40, I've frozen that waterfall in motion. You can see this turbulence here, all of this whitewash. It's incredible, the power of this Godafoss waterfall. And if I move over to the right to the next raw, let's see what I have. I have 1/8 second. So from 1/40 to 1/8, we already get some motion and some blur. So even that little bit in camera, by pushing it up a little bit, I'm able to get really nice effects. But if I go even further, and in this case 2.5 seconds, now that's really starting to come alive. 2.5 seconds, the next one. 4 seconds, 8 seconds, and now here's when it gets really long, 30 seconds and 60 seconds. So you can see from 60 seconds to just a few seconds here, you can see how big of a difference in this area there is. But you can also notice that after just a few seconds, after about 4 seconds, 2 seconds to 4 seconds, these waterfalls, this water is moving so fast, this is moving so fast that it's already looking really good. Super smooth, super nice. That is how you want a waterfall to look. So only a few seconds to get the waterfalls to be nice and smooth. But this turbulent water, that's a different story. At just a few seconds, at 2.5, notice all these edges, all these tendrils. If I start moving up into the 4 second to the 8 second, you can see that these tendrils start to resolve into really silky, smooth streams. So we can go all the way up now to 30 seconds, which looks amazing, and 60 seconds. Now take a look up here on the screen here. At 60, all of this mist has turned just into a flat haze, where 30, I have a mist spot. Do you guys notice there's a mist spot there? But at 60, it's a clean spot because all this has become really smooth. So at this point, it's going to be up to me. Which version do I want to use? Do I want to use the ultra soft water? Do I want to use the frozen in time water? Or do I want to use something in between? And in this case, with this, I don't like all this detail here. I actually like the 30 and the 60. So again, this is going to be up to you guys. But in this case, I'm going to go with the 30 seconds because I have a little bit more color and detail in this area. I'm not going to be too concerned about that water spot. I'm going to take this extra area in the water just so I like that. So I have more color mixed with the white and not too much of this wash effect. So now that I have this selected, let's go ahead and take care of the few things that we need to first, which is the sharpening and again, the profile corrections. The next time we open Lightroom together, I'm going to have these things checked and enabled for you so we don't have to do them again. By this time, you should know where they are and how to adjust them. So back to here, let's go ahead and do a few things to get the details back. Right now it's actually pretty balanced the way it is. I may just want to change some of the shadows a little bit, maybe bring those out a little bit, just so I can pick some of that back up, not too much. And then in the highlights, I may want to pull that just a little bit down. And I'm not really concerned about the sky so much as the water here. I want to make sure that I get the water nice and soft, but I want to also make sure that nothing's blown out in the highlights. And I can see that nothing is blown out here, but obviously with so much accumulation here on the highlights, that obviously makes up for all of this white, where the midtones and the darks are very little and not very present in this image at all. The next step again is to bring back some of the detail in the sky. Remember when we were shooting there together, I really wasn't happy with the sky. We had the nice sunset in the beginning, and then on the other side it was really flat. So we went for this long exposure look, this soft light look instead. But I still think we can pull a little bit of detail about that sky. So I'm going to do that again using a gradient, and it's very easy to use. So we go ahead and draw the gradient. And in this case, and I do this all the time, and this is a good example because I've actually drawn it upside down. So if I change the exposure here, I've actually done it completely opposite. And that's okay actually, because it's easy to just delete it if you select it and do it again. So again, I do that a lot because sometimes I'm not sure if I should draw up and down like I just did or top to bottom. Every software app is a little bit different, but they're really easy to change. So we'll go ahead and change the exposure just a little bit. I don't want to affect the mountains as much. I want to leave those just the way they are, and I'm going to pull the highlights down just a hair, just so I can pull some of that detail back in the sky because it was a little bit washed out. I don't want to add contrast to it. I just want to adjust the exposure just a little bit, just a hair. That'll give me more power inside of Photoshop. That wraps it up for Lightroom. So the next step, just like last time, I'm going to right click and I'm going to say export. This time, export with previous because all my settings are locked in. Great. So now we're in Photoshop, and again, notice the slope on the horizon. Remember when I talked about using the in-camera level? We did that at the cliffs, we trusted it, it was still a little bit off, and then here at Godafoss, I tried to level it, I tried to use the built-in level, but it still didn't look right. Even though it was level, these mountains are troublesome. So this mountain actually gets smaller to the right, so it gives the illusion of the scene actually being crooked when it's not. So instead of rotating it, I'm going to use another quick trick to basically rebalance this horizon. So again, we're distorting reality a little bit because in this case, reality is extremely frustrating when you like symmetry and you like flat, perfect, straight horizons. So what I'm going to do, change this into a layer by double-clicking it, Command T again to bring up the transform, but instead of rotating it, I actually don't want to lose any of this image because I'm so tight on the crop already. Instead, what I'm going to do is hold the Command key and I'm going to grab this little target right here and I'm just going to skew it up. So this is going to be a skew. And what I'm going to do is skew that horizon a little bit so it's more straight and a little bit more even. It doesn't have to be perfect, but basically I want to find a nice balance to where it doesn't look like it's off anymore. I'm going to go up just a little bit more and I'm going to say Enter to apply it. So now I've gone from this to this. So I've skewed it a little bit, I've maintained all the stuff in the foreground that I want, and I've managed to fix the horizon or tweak the horizon to make it look like it actually is flat. Since we're working with another long exposure, I just want to zoom in here and show you guys all of these water spots. I have water spots, dust spots, all sorts of spots all over the place in my dirty sensor. So I wasn't really trying to create more work for you guys, but this is just an unfortunate reality of working in landscapes and in the field. This is just going to happen. And I'm on the field 24/7, 365 days out of the year, except for right now, obviously I'm in the studio. But my sensor gets pretty dirty, and I actually don't like cleaning it myself. I like to take it to the Nikon store or the Fuji store to get that done, but a lot of the times I can't. So this is also tricky because some of these are easy to see, but look at this one here. It's so faint. I don't know if you guys can see that on the screen. I'm going to move it around a little bit. It's so faint. How do I find all these things? Well, there's another really easy way to just pop them out and get rid of them. What I like to do is just to create an adjustment layer really quick, and I'm going to get into adjustment layers later, but for now, click on the Create New Adjustment Layer, and I'm going to pick Brightness and Contrast. This just sits above the layer, affects everything below, but is nonlinear and can be toggled on and off. I'm going to do something that you'd never do otherwise. I'm going to use Legacy, and I'm going to turn the contrast up. And I know it's going to look really horrible. I'm going to turn the brightness down. And now you guys can see, if I zoom in, some of these water spots that weren't as evident, now I'm really starting to see them. So what I can do is aggressively do this with a color correction. Now I'm seeing them here, places I didn't see before. And I can go ahead and remove them. And I do that the same way, just by clicking on this layer here, selecting this tool, and basically clicking and getting rid of them. So thankfully these are pretty easy. Again, water, sky, really no problem because we're dealing with areas of light shades. It's really just water, sky, all white, sometimes some clouds, something really easy. Now I know going through this I'm not going to be able to get them all, but I'm going to do my best to get the ones that are most visually impactful. And later on, if I missed a few, I can always go back and get the rest. Really though, it's important to get rid of as many as you can because they start to look bad. And it looks a little bit amateurish. Not the fact that your sensor is dirty, because that happens to everybody, but basically because you didn't take the thought to remove it on portfolio images. Man, they really annoy me. I try to zap them all out, and even though I think I get them all, more always end up popping up. It's really frustrating. And again, simple solution would have been to clean my sensor, but that didn't happen. That's about as good as it's going to get. I'm going to trash this horrible brightness and contrast layer, and we're going to keep on moving forward on this image. Spots are gone. Let's go up to filter again, and this is where it's going to start to get repetitive. I'm going to use Color Effects Pro to pop out the details. Back in Color Effects Pro, I'm going to pick my very favorite. You guys are going to see a lot of this Pro Contrast. Let's check what happens when I crank the dynamic contrast. See all the detail in the water just comes alive, finally comes back alive. I'm going to go soft on the contrast because I don't want to crush any of these values here that I'm so careful to maintain. And this is the first time here I'm going to introduce correct color cast. Now it does exactly that. Now in this case, the whole image is overall cool. The reason is when I was shooting long exposure, I always lock my custom white balance, but I didn't change it in Lightroom, and it came out a little bit cold. When we're in the field, it's really hard to tell until we blow these up on a big monitor, and then we can see that they're a little bit cool. So in this case, it should be a no-brainer for correct color cast to be able to mitigate some of that cool temperature. And you can see here now before and after, it actually added some of the warmth back into the image while keeping some of the cool tones in the water. That looks pretty good. The next thing that I'm going to add, again, is contrast color range. And this is a little bit frustrating that you always have to zero this out. You could create a custom preset that has a different value, and that would solve it too. But I don't know, for some reason I don't mind. It's not that bad. So if I start to pull the color contrast here, I really want you guys to pay attention to the before and after. Now this was a really flat image. By using this, now I'm able to chisel out some of the color separation. I have blue now in the stream, creamy tones here, really nice brown ones here, and even this has started to get a little bit more detail. So it's starting to look pretty nice. Now I don't want to go too heavy on it. I'll go a little light at first, and I'll just check that before and after. And so far, that looks pretty good. Let's add one more to this round, and then we'll take a look at the comparison of the before and after. Remember, polarization is going to crank those blues, and in this case, hopefully those cyans. And you can see that it's darkened those colors up a little bit. So before and after. I'm going to roll that back a little bit. I don't like what it's doing here, which means that I can remove it just a little bit here. Now this is nice too because you can change the scale of the U-points, but I didn't show you guys that you can also change the opacity. So right now I'm removing it, but if I start to turn this up, it's going to leave a little bit of it back. So it's just going to remove a certain percentage of it from that area, and I'm going to say OK. With that effect applied, let's take a look at the before and after. So this was the adjusted raw in Lightroom, very flat, especially by comparison now. It's starting to look really cool. We're getting a lot of color back, a lot of details. That sky is starting to look really dramatic, really nice. You can see it kind of almost looks like storm clouds. And I started to notice here that I'm chiseling out details of the waterfall. So one of the problems with the long exposure is, especially when there's a lot of mist, this will start to look a little bit flat because you have all this water accumulation, all of this whitewash is just creating this mist, and it's taking away some of the detail. Toggling this layer on and off, and you can see that I'm chiseling out some of that detail and making these almost look like they're 3D. And that's a quality that I like to have in my work. I like there to be depth. So we can't capture capture emotions. We can't capture the way people feel or the way you feel, but you can translate emotions into visual elements, and those things are color, light, texture, detail. But if you want to create depth in a scene, the easiest way to do it is to have separation in the foreground, midground, and background, separation in the colors, and what I like to do is create a nice 3D effect. Light is what creates a three-dimensional effect. That's why light works so well in photography, because it illuminates a portion of the image, causes shadows and highlights in different areas. Sometimes, though, with these soft light conditions, it needs a little bit more encouragement. That's what we're going to work on next. And in order to do that, we're going to go into Color Efex Pro one more time, because I want to show you guys how to pop those values, and then we're going to do it selectively. So I'm going to go back into Color Efex Pro 4 and apply tonal contrast. First thing I might want to do, though, let's go back into Pro Contrast. This is nice when you create, I call these color correction cocktails. I know that sounds kind of funny. We're putting multiple color and contrast corrections together, so I call them cocktails of different effects. So we're going to start just by bumping the Pro Contrast and Dynamic just to pull it up just a little bit, add another filter, and tonal contrast. Again, too much tonal contrast is too much, but look at the before and after. Remember I was talking about three-dimensional waterfalls, and I was talking about this detail, just adding depth and dimension? Well, this is overcooking it for sure. You can see that it's starting to give me that effect, especially in the water. So now I get all of these details, but I also get all of the different color ranges, tonal ranges. I've got all these wisps and tendrils, all this really cool detail. Here I'm starting to see the rocks underneath the water. This is way overdone, so let's go ahead and zero it out. And I'm just going to go very soft on the midtones here and very soft on the shadows. So I'm just going to add a little bit. And I'm going to pull the saturation up just a little bit. Never take the saturation above 10 or 15%. 5% is usually pretty nice. It just brings back some of the saturation in the darks when it overcooks the contrast. That's all that does. Checking the tonal contrast here, I'm just going to say okay, and I'm going to make this just really pronounced effect of these chiseled waterfalls. Here we go. Let's take a look at the result before and after. I think it's a little bit much, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to roll it back with the opacity, well, maybe about 60, 70%, so knock off about 30% of that. And what I'm going to do is duplicate this layer with Command J, and instead of selecting them and right-clicking, I'm just going to select the top layer and do Command E. And that's actually going to be merged down. So I've created a new layer that's 100% opacity with this nice additional effect that I wanted. Now we've spent a lot of time in Color Efex Pro really pushing that color separation, pushing that contrast separation. Now it's time to take it into our own hands and use something that's called dodging and burning. Believe it or not, dodging and burning has been around as long as Photoshop's been around, and I have been using Photoshop since 1999. Since version 5, we were able to dodge and burn. Obviously, the tools have gotten a little bit better, the color application is a little bit better, but the theory and the practice has stayed the same. So chances are you guys have already been dodging and burning in some way, whether it's luminosity masking or it's selectively with paint or it's done with gradient ramps. However you've been doing it, I'm going to show you guys how to do it very simply and very efficiently with the paintbrush. First thing we're going to do is create a dodge and burn layer the manual way. And the manual way is actually by creating a new layer, going into the color palette here, and changing it to 50% gray. So if I slide this up and down, you notice that this changes. Change that to 50%. Say 50%, 50% gray, and I'm going to fill this layer with the foreground color. So that's going to be Option Delete. Background color would be Command. Now that that's gray, if I actually change this to overlay, it's neutral. Now here's where it gets really fun, and I'm going to show you guys this really fast. We can paint black and white and accentuate highlights and shadows. So the first thing that I need to do is reset my palette to black and white by hitting D on the keyboard. That's going to make it black and white. Remember, I can toggle from foreground to background color by hitting the X. Now, with the brush enabled, you're always going to paint your foreground layer. So hitting X allows me to paint black or white or different combinations of the both and change on the fly. So I'm going to hit B for the brush key. Remember, I can change my size here on the fly. I'm going to hit 1 on the keyboard for a 10% flow, and I'll watch this. I'm going to say right here down in the foreground, what would happen if I started painting white? Well, notice that my highlights are going to start to come out here. So I can actually change or dodge the highlights. So I can start to add the lighting back in. Now I said add because I'm adding luminance, but I'm not changing the lighting. What I'm doing is finding little areas that already have light on them, like these areas here, and I'm accentuating them, almost like I'm airbrushing something into 3D. So think of this as kind of airbrushing your image, though it's done selectively, and it's done with a paintbrush. So again, I have all of the pressure sensitivity with the stylus. This makes me feel a little bit more like an artist. If I was using a mouse, I'd be doing it click, 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 and it wouldn't feel as intuitive, and I couldn't do these beautiful long brush strokes. So again, let's take a look at this. I'm going to go ahead and hit X, switch to black, and watch what happens if I start to burn some of this back. And I'm going to preview this layer really quick. I just want you guys to see what's happening here. 50% gray on overlay, shows through, completely transparent. White enhances it, so it sort of overlays it, makes it a little bit more intense, a little bit brighter. Black burns it, so it's dodge and burn. It's really nice. But again, that was kind of a complicated way to make a layer because there were a lot of steps. There is a built-in easy way to create a dodge and burn layer. And you can do that by holding Option, clicking that same new layer button, and it's going to ask you what you want to do. Well, in this case, I can just say dodge, burn, because I should also be showing you guys how to be organized with your files, unlike me. So we're going to say, under Mode, set it to Overlay, and as soon as I do that, it's going to ask me if I want to fill that neutral color 50% gray, and of course I want to say yes. By clicking this, changing this to Overlay, I say OK. It automatically sets it to Overlay and gets it ready, and now it's ready for me to paint. So remember how I was doing some nice stuff in the foreground here? Let's really examine that again. B for brush, I'm going to use a very light flow. I like to use light flow and press harder. That's just my preference. You guys may be the complete opposite. But I'm just going to go ahead and bring some of these highlights up in the foreground, and I'm really just going to go around on these sides of the rocks, things that I think that are going to look really nice if I start to pop them out a little bit and pull some of this light back into the image. So again, I'm following natural lighting patterns. Here's where it gets interesting. In the water, let's say I do this on the rocks here. I can actually start to bring out some of that detail in the rocks. If I paint black, I can actually start to watch this. I can start to chisel out some of that detail in the waterfall. So this is actually a painterly effect, and it's really nice. So all of these shadows, all of these things I can maintain by painting black and white, and I can start to create shading and dimension to some of these areas. Now, really pay attention to this waterfall right here. It's dark on the side and light on this side because we actually have light coming from the sky. This is natural lighting coming in. So all I'm going to do is just start to enhance it a little bit. So I want to pull those shadows back and create more of a dramatic look for these waterfalls. I really want people to feel like they're three-dimensional, like they're really popping out of here. It's going to be really nice. And it takes a little bit of time, but it's also a very artistic approach. And this is one of those things that you can spend a few minutes on or you can spend hours, but it's really the key to a lot of people's landscape photography. People really like to dodge and burn certain areas to give it more of a 3D look. But here's where it's going to get really interesting. So these tendrils of water look really nice. If I do really, really light burning here, it's going to darken that water up. And I can actually just paint and brush stroke this in. And it's going to give me some power over these dimensions. Even by adding the shadow or amplifying the shadow here next to the waterfall, I can actually break and separate this part of the waterfall from the bottom one. So basically this is, in a nutshell, dodging and burning. And it's really fun, and it can go pretty much any way you want. And this is where it gets nice, where a lot of things end up being procedures, things that you do over and over again. Dodging and burning is something that you can do liberally, you can do conservatively. It's really up to you. You can omit it altogether, but it really gives you power over the look of your image. So if you think about standing here in the same spot, shooting the same image as everybody else, and then coming away with something different, obviously we're going to use different tools, different color correctors, we have a different eye, but this gives us the ability to really help control the light. And that's what photography is all about. It's all about the light. And this is where it gets really fun. We can zoom right in on these little details on the rocks. And this is something that I'll do in the later lessons. I'll do more and more of this. So these little details here, these highlights in the grass, all those little things I can actually bring out and accentuate and almost pop them out so that they're more noticeable, so the eye gets attracted to these really great things. It's a really nice way to work. And again, burning, the same thing. We can create more dimension and more shadows. The nice thing about this is once it's done, and I'll just go ahead and create more. I want to create a little bit around this area here. So a little bit more highlights, a little bit more shadows. It's looking pretty nice, actually. starting to come together. If I toggle this on and off, you can see that before and then after, I end up having more dimension and everything back in the image. Just like any other layer though, if I think I went too far, I can roll it back just a little bit, maybe to about 80%, just for that extra little bit of punch. Last thing that I'm going to do here is I'm going to duplicate this layer again. I'm going to create another high pass filter. So I'm going to say filter, other, high pass. I'm going to do the same thing as 3. We've already done this once, so I'm going to set this again to overlay. And I don't want any sharpening on any of this waterfall. I just want a little bit here and a little bit here. So instead of creating a white mask, I'm going to hold the Option key this time, click the mask button, and that allows me to create a black mask. So just click it, you get a white one. Option, click it, you get a black mask. I'm going to switch my palette to white. I'm going to turn the flow up to about 50%, and I'm just going to start selectively painting on where I want my sharpness. Go back to hit the backslash key here, and then I'm just going to paint all this in exactly where I want it. I do not want any sharpening in my water, just in this foreground. And again, if you miss a few spots, it's not really that big of a deal. And also think about your eye flow. My eye always goes right towards the sharpest areas first. So I like to have a lot of sharpening in my foreground, and I like to roll it back a little bit into the background. So 100% sharpening with a high pass here in the foreground, and then maybe about 50% in the background. And this allows me to do it just really creatively, really intuitively with brush strokes, without having to do anything complicated. Most people get started in photography and they want to get started in post-processing, and they think the most complicated method is the best method, but that's not always true. A lot of the times, the most complicated method is actually just very complicated, and then the simpler way is actually the best solution. I'll disable that quick mask and we'll take a look at what we have now. And what I always like to do is really start from the before all the way to the after. I'm just going to put my high pass filter on the top. I kind of like that for organizational points. Let's just go ahead and turn everything off and everything back on. It's a really useful option if you're doing this before and after. If you want to solo a layer, if you hold Option and click the eyeball for the layer you want to solo, it'll turn everything off but that layer. And then if you click it again, it'll turn everything back on. So this was our before. This is what we took out of Lightroom and had very basic enhancements. You can see how flat and dull the color looks. Water looks beautiful, but it needs a little bit of work. And then in a few short minutes, we actually went from this to this. At this point, I may want to point out that we're using Color Effects Pro, and we're using combinations of dynamic contrast, tonal contrast, color contrast, all these different contrasts. Well, those contrasts are going to reveal a lot more of those dust spots. So I bet if I zoom into this guy, and I did a pretty good job, now I'm actually starting to see the extents of my sensor, like I have more spots to clean up. So at this point, I'd have to go back to this tool, clean up even more before I could have this in my portfolio. So it's very important to go in and clean all these spots up, but I'm not going to bore you guys with this one since we're going to be cleaning up spots throughout this tutorial in different phases. But now you know how to do it, so we can go ahead and move on to the next lesson. So again, we were able to take a very simple shot, a single exposure at 30 seconds, get the really beautiful water here. We were able to get a really nice composition, make a composition out of a very flat sky while still getting some nice sky detail, and we were able to chisel out all those effects. Again, a good takeaway from this lesson is that we can always toggle these on and off, and we can change the opacity depending on what our taste favors. Even these layers here, with the color adjustments, I can change the opacity a little bit just to roll them back and get the complete custom look that I want. So that wraps up lesson number 3. Next time in lesson number 4, I'm going to show you guys how to stitch panos in both Lightroom and Photoshop.